All right, we will start with looking at the survey. Let's see if I can pull that up on the screen. Nope. Dang it. Okay, let me try again. Oh, poo-poo. I hate it when the Zoom call tells me I can't do certain things. It's just so rude. All right, I'm almost there with the survey results. Oh, the survey results will be different because more people have voted. Okay, that's exciting. So right now, I think I have like 100 students and 43 have voted. So, oops. So I'll probably wait a little longer to see if more people vote. But they may not, not everybody votes. I get it. All right, back to your screen so I can share that screen. Live PD, isn't that the craziest thing? Although when I was young, those cop shows were really, really trendy. Poop. I'm going to say poop a lot today because I'm not quite grown up enough to actually curse. Okay, here's the survey. All right, so far we have 43 people responding. We could list them, but I don't want to because that ruins the anonymity, doesn't it? Or maybe we can't list them. I don't know. I don't want to know. All right. Do you want more or fewer questions? We're leaning towards more. It's like a 60-40 split-ish. Remember, math's not my thing. Are the questions too hard, too easy, about right? Nobody voted too easy. Good job. But more of you voted about right than I expected, to be honest. The grades were a little bit lower, but not substantially. You guys did pretty well. And then this is interesting to me. One of you thinks no reason for the review. Some of you think it's helpful and some of you not so much. So we're at about a 60-40 split there as well. I thought, I know you probably wouldn't agree with me, that quiz number 1 was too easy. So I wasn't trying to make this substantially harder. Your grades kind of reflect that it was a little harder, but maybe not substantially. But I haven't made the next quiz, but I will do that over the next couple of days and then put up a new review for you, okay? And if you have any comments or concerns, feel free to share them individually. A couple of you have. I'm sorry I haven't responded yet. But I will. I'm sorry. And, or, take the survey if you haven't taken it. Tell me your thoughts. You could also type in the chat if you wanted. And then weekly questions, see if I left that up. Oh, I did leave that up. Okay, that's good. Weekly question. World War II is often referred to as the Good War. Evaluate that title for the war. Is it appropriate? Why or why not? And my expectation in your answer, sorry, a yawn is coming, would be that you use specific detail, examples. So names of people, names of places, events, dates. So don't just say Hitler was bad, we defeated him, it ended the Holocaust, so clearly it was a good war. So make sure that you use specific examples. And I'm really kind of looking for some US related examples, although I don't blame you for mentioning Hitler. He was bad and it's good that we defeated him. So mention Hitler if you like, but remember, US history class. So we always want some US history examples. And I think I'd mentioned to you that I've graded lots of the first question, chapter 18, but not quite done. So I'll finish that today, hopefully between your class and the last class of the day. I think for some reason, your class is the last one I haven't finished grading. Not really sure why I graded you guys last. So save the best for last. We'll go with that, maybe. All right, and I think I need to open the notes and then we can start looking at those. I think I closed them for some reason. Go figure. Serna, what do you think? All right, see if I can find them now. All right, notes, looks like they're up. All right, so I feel like we stopped at the chart section last time, and I will mention a couple things to you. Now, I know I haven't put out the what's going to be on the quiz stuff yet, but I'm guaranteeing you I'm going to put D-Day on the quiz. You heard me. We're going to put D-Day on the quiz because it really matters. D-Day. And oh no, I made the chart a new size. I was trying to highlight it. I do that. Oh no. Okay. That's kind of what I meant to do. All right, so D-Day's here. Can I highlight it without changing the size of the chart? So make sure that you pay attention to D-Day. There's more about it in your book, so it's not that you just want to know those things. Although that probably would help you. But we'll go over kind of general battle stuff. And again, because it's not a military history class, oh gosh, crud. Oh. Sorry, it's such a bad day in physical therapy. I can't lift that cup. Goodness. Any of you want to be physical therapists, just don't be mean, okay? Ooh, in my notes, 10,000 Allied casualties, 2,500 dead. Is there a word missing? Probably. I don't know. I could go back and look. I probably didn't put what, are you asking? Because I think mine says 10,000.
I think I'm just confused by it saying 10,000 dead and then 2,500 dead right after that. Like, what is the 25?
Oh, so 10,000 casualties. So those are the injured people. And then the 2,500 are dead.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, you're good. I'd much rather you ask than didn't. So, and I wasn't getting the question either. So sorry. Okay. Because it's not a military history class, I'm not going to ask you about too many battles. So sorry. But Battle of the Atlantic is just the general war for control of the oceans for shipping purposes to get stuff between the United States and our European allies, although we really don't try very hard to send stuff to the Soviet Union, which will be a huge point of contention once the war's over. Battle of Stalingrad is as far as the Germans advance into the Soviet Union after they break the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression treaty, which had promised that they wouldn't attack each other. Operation Torch is the US and Allied forces, the Allied forces' first defeat of the German forces in Northern Africa. Before that, General Erwin Rommel had great success with the German Afrika Korps tank command, and he had written several books about tank warfare. I think it was just called The Essence of Tank Warfare or something like that. And for whatever reason, a good thing, the American tank commander, a guy named George Patton, had read those books. So it gave him a fairly important advantage in fighting against Erwin Rommel. So, and Patton is, well, Rommel, I guess you could read about Rommel, although I'd prefer you read about an American general. But if you wanted to read about Patton or Eisenhower or MacArthur or George Marshall or anybody who from the US that fought in World War II, you could do that. There's some book written recently that some kid read about. I think the guy's name was Zaffarini, but I can't remember. Somebody did that for their book review. He's not a super famous guy, but it's a more recent book that came out that was a biography. There's some book that somebody wanted to read that was interviews with survivors of, I think it was people who participated in D-Day, or maybe it was survivors of Pearl Harbor, but almost anything that you want to read about World War II and US military is fine. You could also read about, we'll talk about that in a minute. I don't want to jump ahead, sorry. So Operation Torch is really kind of the first big time you see Patton involved. D-Day is a hugely important battle, which is why I'm putting it on the quiz. So it's the beginning of the Allied retaking of France, of Western Europe. And that assault is multi-pronged. It's got several different places for landing. It's an amphibious assault. It's very complicated. It's coordinated by Eisenhower, who's the supreme Allied commander in the Atlantic theater. So he plays an important role in that. Battle of the Bulge is kind of Hitler's last offensive, or the Germans' last offensive, and that's in Belgium. So it's really close to the German border. And you'll see Patton involved in that as well to shore up that bulge, which is where the line was starting to break. And that was really the end for Germany, although, you know, it's the end of 1944, so it's not like things had been going well. But I think it's really fascinating that it takes all of these years to build up to success in Western Europe, but you had to have success across the Atlantic first. So, you know, it just takes a while. And then the East, the Russians had to start pushing back. And then from the south up through Italy, you know, Northern Africa, and then through Sicily, and then through Italy. So once those prongs of the German army were defeated and they were starting to push back, then there was more success in the West as well. And Victory in Europe Day is May 8th, 1945, and that's the German surrender. That's shortly after suicide, death of Hitler. So, okay. All right, Pacific stuff. The Philippines is really, oh, somebody's chatting, let me look. Yeah. I would assume that forever and ever in the U.S. Army, you will talk about Patton because he's such an important general. He does some crucial things at crucial times. He's also a little on the edge of, well, he's unusual. We'll go with that. I don't want to be terribly judgmental, but he does think he's a reincarnated general from several other eras. And he's also kind of a weird dude that likes to recite poetry from time to time, but it's pretty harsh on himself and his troops. But his troops really loved and appreciated him. He's one of those guys that you probably don't want as your dad, you probably don't want as your neighbor, but you probably do need him in battle. He's an interesting fellow, he is, and highly accomplished and admirable. And I had a grandfather who was in part of the supply train for Patton in World War II, and he would occasionally tell the story. So, and I know that my grandfather thought quite a bit of him, even though he was very hard, ouch, on his supply lines as well, because he outpaced them a lot. So it's hard to keep up with him. He also would steal supplies from other allies if he thought he could use them better. He really is a fascinating guy, so he's worthy of study. And he's that combination of, I don't think we like him, to I don't know how we could live without him. And then his death, as I think you were intimating there, is also pretty suspicious as well, because he ends up getting run off the road after he gets demoted because he says some what Eisenhower thought were inappropriate things about the Soviet Union and Germans at the same time, because the Soviets were our ally, but Patton didn't trust them. So he said that out loud, which got him in some trouble. And then he gets demoted from being the commander of the 1st Armored Division. I think it's 1st, might have been 4th, but I think it was 1st. And then he's on a hunting trip in Bavaria and gets run off the road, and the accident paralyzes him and he dies shortly after. So, no, it's yeah, people have always thought that there was something up there. And that, the TV guy that writes all those killing books, he wrote a book about that. What's that guy's name? Was on Fox and then he wasn't. Bill O'Reilly, that guy. So, and I've had people read those books for book review as well. You know, I'm always fascinated where everybody kind of sits politically, which is why I try really hard, although I know I'm not always successful, I'm not talking about politics, but you know, I had somebody ask if they could read one of those killing books that Bill O'Reilly wrote, and I said sure, because he co-wrote them with another person who is actually a historian. And I'm not trying to denigrate Bill O'Reilly. I'm going to say out loud, I'm extremely jealous because he's not a historian and can write a history book and make millions of dollars. I've not made millions of dollars with my history knowledge, which I think is more substantial than his, although I know he says he was a history teacher as well. But the historian he works with is a guy named Martin Dugard, who's a fairly respected historian. So, you know, even though his political positions are a little right of center, it's my understatement of the day, and you'll find historians whose positions are left of center. Typically, you know, the history that they write is still worth your time. And even if you think that it's skewed or not balanced or biased, then that gives you something to write about when you assess it. So as long as you recognize the bias, I think anything that you read is probably valuable. Whether you learn good things from it or you learn like, that's not really a source that I want to trust. Again, not suggesting that about those Bill O'Reilly books, because I think that they're typically fine as far as histories go. And of course, any historian, you've noticed that with Foner, or anybody who writes a textbook, is going to decide what they put in and what they leave out. So, all right, I'll stop talking about that. Back to battles. You could read a number of books about what happens in the Philippines. It's called the Bataan Death March. None of those books would be good. I mean, that's a horrific story of incredible torture from the Japanese to a number of American and Filipino soldiers, contractors who were left in the Philippines when the United States takes out the officers and leaves some of the enlisted and the contractors and the Filipinos there and kind of hold down the fort literally, and knowing that it's not going to go well. So they get captured by the Japanese and they go on the Bataan Death March, which is supposed to get them to China, Manchuria, where they work on railroads, but it's, yeah, not pretty. Okay. Battle of the Coral Sea stops the Japanese advance towards Australia and New Zealand, so it's important. Battle of Midway, there's a ton of stuff written about that as well. It's the first major defeat of the modern Japanese Navy, so that's important as well. What you see in the next kind of series of battles, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, are some of the island hopping battles where in some of the minor, smaller islands of the Pacific, the Allied strategy is just to take the islands they think are most important rather than taking all of them. And this is where you see kamikaze pilots, and you really see that philosophy of fighting to the death. So casualty numbers are going to be incredibly high on these islands. Iwo Jima is the one where they have the flag raising ceremony at the end of the battle. And you see that depicted a lot and then kind of remade after 9/11. And I suspect you know what I'm trying to say if I'm not saying it well. And then, of course, you know, the Pacific ends with the United States, fighting in the Pacific theater ends with the United States dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and threatening to drop a third if they didn't surrender. Now, we didn't have a third, but they didn't know that. And you, of course, can read all sorts of things that are written about this. And they'll range from military kind of stuff to more social history kind of stuff. Was it John Hershey? Is his books Hiroshima? I almost always have a student read about that, where some stories of people who survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And of course, that's rough stuff. I'm also going to suggest to you, we won't talk as much about this as maybe we should. Well, maybe we will, I don't know. But during that era, you know, there's a race, of course, by several nations to build this type of weapon first. And the assumption is whoever builds it first will use it. So there's not as much of a hesitance about using the bomb as a weapon of war as you might imagine, which you will probably find kind of scandalous and sad and rough and all that sort of thing. You know, in the culture of that time period, it was sort of assumed that whoever got there first would use it. And kind of the general philosophy of people from that era who also taught people from my era was, well, I'm just glad we got it first. Because if the Germans had gotten it first or the Japanese had gotten it first, the world would be, you know, a different place, which of course is true. You know, if anything had changed, the world would be a different place. But I know, as you know, people from my generation and then older than me would think, you know, somebody was going to get it. I'm glad it was us. That's sort of our conclusion, our generational conclusion, which of course is much more nuanced if we have an actual discussion about it. And you know, of course, that, well, maybe you don't know. We'll talk about it in the next chapter a little bit more. When Truman became president, he was unaware of the Manhattan Project because, you know, it was a secret. So when he found out we had the bomb, he was surprised, and we'll go with excited. But I don't mean like woohoo, we get to nuke somebody, but maybe relieved is about it. But there's also a lot written about the decision to actually use the weapons, and you could read something about that if you like. But you know, any general battle, that sort of thing from World War II that has a lot of U.S. involvement in it, that would be something you could read about, absolutely. And there's great bios there's tons of Patton, but also Eisenhower, MacArthur, lots of people, George Marshall, lots of people who fought in World War II or led in World War II. And there's lots written about specific battles as well. So, all right. Oh, since I'm mentioning book review, it's due November 30th. November 30th. I noticed somebody wrote something in the chat. Let me look. Okay, you're asking OSS. I think that would be fine. Yeah. Somebody asked, oh, I'm trying to think in the other class what somebody asked about. Oh, it was a different topic. Okay. But yeah, if you have, the only thing I would ever want you to do as far as books is just kind of double check with me to make sure. I know it sounds dumb and it's only happened a couple times, and that would not be a subject that it would have happened about. But every once in a while somebody will ask about a subject that they want to read about, and I'll tell them it was okay, and then the book they actually read is written for third graders, but no OSS books about third graders, so or for third graders, so I'm sure that would be okay. Maybe really unusual third graders, right? I don't know. All right. Back in the United States, what's going on back in the United States? We're making stuff. That's what's going on. So the economy changes pretty dramatically during this time period. Unemployment's no longer an issue. Everybody's back to work. We're drafting people. We're trying to get women to go to work. It's not that hard. I mean, at first a little bit, but not that hard. 50 million men will register for the draft. 10 million men will serve. It'll be more than 10, I think, by the time we're done. War Production Board coordinates industry in the war effort. So when we declared the NRA unconstitutional, we've kind of changed our minds about it because now it's wartime and there's more of an emergency situation. So the War Production Board is going to coordinate industry in the war effort and really tell businesses what it is they should make. And businesses will do that. And then businesses will also try to maybe play on their employees a little bit, their patriotic spirit during this time period, and tell them you can't go on strike and we may have to freeze wages from time to time, but you're doing it for your country. Now, as a rule, people didn't get terribly upset during this time period about their wages because they had wages. They hadn't really had any in a while, and they're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. so they're making a lot of money. Now, groups who do get upset about their wages are people who aren't paid the same as other people who do the same jobs. So sometimes women, but primarily people of color, African Americans, a little more particularly because they're going to be more likely to live in the North where there are unions that they're a part of. So there's a big strike, which you could write about, read about. The big union that the guy that kind of starts it all is called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And you're like, what the heck is that? It started as a union for guys who worked on trains and guys who worked on passenger trains specifically. And so they would go, people used to travel by train and they'd have sleeping cars, hence sleeping car porters. So they're like room service, but on a train, or housekeeping, but on a train. So it's primarily African-American men. So they form a union, and the head of their union in this era, and they're not all guys that work on trains at this point, but this is primarily an African-American workers union. It's headed by a guy named Asa Philip Randolph, who's going to threaten a strike. He's going to tell FDR, we're going to go on strike until you pay African-American defense contract laborers the same as white defense contract laborers. So in companies where they were making things for the war effort, they were paying black men less than they were paying white men. And so they said, we're going to go on strike. And then FDR said, no, don't go on strike, and created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, where you could go appeal directly if you were being paid less. And that worked in that era. And then there'll be a discussion about whether to expand that or not after the war effort. The nascent, let's go back to the notes here. So, consumer goods are going to be rationed because most manufacturing businesses are making things for the war effort. And rationing, of course, is limiting the amount of something you could buy. You had to have a ration coupon or a ration stamp or booklet to allow you to buy certain things like tires or fuel. You could only buy so much gas per month. I think you could only have a set of tires every 3 to 4 years. Women couldn't buy, I don't know that women in the South do this anyway as much, but they used to wear stockings or nylons, pantyhose essentially. And so women, they were using those for nets and other parts of artillery, and they used, I guess, nylon in netting and uniforms as well. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but in parts of bomb shells, but I don't know anything about making a bomb. I'm sure that's hugely shocking. But I don't know if it'd be better if you had a professor that says, I know exactly how to make a bomb, but that might also mean they had some military service, although I know you don't sit around making bombs in the military, but you probably know how they work a little bit better than, I do. But anyway, women used leg makeup during that time period, which is weird to me, but they would draw a straight line on the back because that represented the seam of the pantyhose or something. Certain types of fabric, wool was wool, W-O-O-L. I don't know if you can understand what I'm trying to say, is rationed during that time period. For me, the hardest thing was chocolate was rationed during that time period. I don't know if I would have been okay back then, but for the war effort, of course you would sacrifice for that. But lots of things were rationed in that era. Because everybody's working, more people than ever were paying income tax. So it goes from 4 million people paying income tax in 1940 to 40 million in 45. A huge increase in annual income and revenue for the United States. So it helps kind of pay down some of the war debt, so we're not in excessive debt when we get out of the war. You're going to see people move to the West Coast to work in defense industries that especially help in the Pacific side of the war effort. And you may remember that a lot of folks had relocated from the Midwest to the West during the Dust Bowl as well. So there's already a supply of workers there. No strike pledges. And free enterprise is often considered to be the fifth freedom. Your book talks about that a lot because, give me liberty, that sort of thing. Office of War Information produces pro-war posters and propaganda at first. And then some people thought, well, they're really promoting the extension of the New Deal more than they are the war effort. And then other people started to kind of get in on this, and they would sell stuff saying that it was patriotic, and if you buy our product, you're supporting the war effort, that sort of thing. And this is also when you get the big Rosie the Riveter campaign. So I think maybe I left the Rosie the Riveter poster open. Let me see. Maybe I didn't. I assume that you've seen this before, but sometimes I'm wrong about things like that. Now I left open Zoot Suits, so let me find Rosie the Riveter and share it with you. I assume you've seen this. Okay. Let me go back to you. Where are you? Oh my goodness. There you are. Let me see if I can share the right thing. No, it's not there. Poop. Try again. All right, one more try. There it is. Okay. So I assume you've seen the Rosie the Riveter poster painting. This is a Norman Rockwell painting from the time period. One of the things that I think is moderately interesting about Rosie the Riveter, and it is modeled after an actual woman during that time period. That's a pretty good article too, because it talks about all the different things that women do in the war effort. Let me share that link with you if you want to read it. Oh, and now we've got to buy insurance. We had just spent a couple of decades talking about why women should not be in the workforce, how it makes them frustrated, it makes them angry, it makes them ugly, it makes them infertile, it makes them unattractive to men. So we just spent a couple of decades being fairly conservative and telling women they needed to stay at home. Well, now we needed women to go to work, and we've just spent a lot of time telling them that, all that stuff I just said. So how are we going to get women to go to work besides saying we really need you at work? So when they make these posters and drawings of women at work, it's really important that the women look attractive. So one of the things you'll notice is that Rosie is not ugly. Rosie's not ugly. So it's important that Rosie look attractive so that people won't think, oh my goodness, if we go to work, we'll be ugly and infertile and unattractive, and dudes won't like us. Yeah. So they wanted to make sure that the iconic image of Rosie was attractive as well. And I think it's kind of ironic that lots of feminist groups use that image to sort of like go, women, we are tough, that sort of thing, which of course I agree with. However, that was not exactly the purpose of that image originally. So I think that's moderately interesting. You're going like, yeah, I don't care. Or you're going, no, that's fascinating. That's the greatest thing I've heard all day. That's what you're saying, isn't it? I know it is. All right, back to the notes, maybe. We'll see. Notes. All right, maybe. All right, there they are. Okay. So U.S. women begin to take men's jobs in labor industries and manufacturing. Rosie the Riveter makes bombs along with other women who aspire to be like her. Thousands of women join women Air Force service pilots, WACS and WAVES, WACS and WAVES. So there are women involved in several different parts of the service. And while it's not intended to be a massive cultural change. You know, we're not especially hoping that women serve in the military in equal numbers during this time period. And we're surely not hoping that women will be a permanent part of the workforce. They are okay with women being temporarily involved in these industries. And, you know, they're going to portray this as patriotic and not unfeminine and that sort of thing. And our federal government fairly quickly will start to have discussions with other governments in the West about what the post-war world will look like. So you're going to have some discussion of creating a United Nations, but also some of FDR's advisors are going to say, we are going to make the whole world like the United States. So kind of the same way that you saw the progressives being optimistic about US involvement in World War I or the Great War, because it's going to help the United States spread the culture, the great US culture, throughout the rest of the world. And, you know, I wouldn't argue. I mean, some of our culture is pretty cool, I suppose. I know everybody else's culture is nice too. But, you know, we wanted everyone to buy the stuff that we bought and have access to the stuff that we had access to and see our movies and listen to our music. And we could also sell our stuff other places. You know, that's always a thing. So here we could have full employment. Capitalism could help end poverty. So I think it's probably a little bit of a misnomer to think that people saw the New Deal and New Deal-like programs where the government maybe helps create full employment as socialism. They really saw this as government-assisted capitalism in some ways. And I know some of you are going like, no, that's not what it is. But I'm just telling you, from their perspective, they were not pushing socialism. They were pushing the American form of government and economics, which they saw as government-directed capitalism. So we could spread this US power and prosperity and consumerism across the world and modernize the world, then everything would get better. Everything would get more modern. We could fight disease. People would have better technology and good music and movies. They would have more money. And typically when you have more money, you're healthier. There's all sorts of statistics that back that up. So even though I know that this is very like ethnocentric and maybe a little nationalistic, okay, it's a lot nationalistic. I don't want to say their intentions were good. I suppose they were, but their thought was, be more like us is better. So they're not thinking we want to take over the whole world necessarily. Now that may change as we get closer to the Cold War in some ways. But their thought is we want to spread the good things about our society to the whole world. Now we're not being very introspective during this era about what are the things we need to change, although that's about to happen. You'll start to see that happening in the 50s. So, because we'll change some fairly bad stuff throughout the world. We'll start to talk about how we may have elements of that fairly bad stuff within our own country, and it might be time to try to change that within our own country. So you'll see that happening after the war. So FDR's Economic Bill of Rights, which was the idea that we were going to end poverty, that everyone in the United States would be guaranteed a job, they would have access to education, free at least through high school, but possibly college as well, in an era when not very many people went to college, that everybody would have access to a really low cost, reasonable home loan if you wanted to buy a house. We did decide that was probably too expensive, so we decided to embed those programs into the military. So it leads to creation of something called the GI Bill of Rights, which guarantees that if you serve in the military, that you will get college tuition discounts or free college tuition, depending on where you go and how long you go and that sort of thing, lower cost home mortgages, healthcare, that sort of stuff. So it's at least supposed to be a guarantee that our military can maybe not be impoverished. Now, I know some of you have been in the military and you go like, but the wages, and I know the wages are extraordinarily low for what it is you guys have to do sometimes. So sorry. Kind of, no, it's not. I was going to say teacher wages are low too, but yeah, we hardly ever get shot at. I don't want to say never, but it's pretty rare. I think I never got shot at, by the way. Although I think there were 2 times I was in school when they had a weapon, and I did get a knife pulled on me once, but I did not handle it as well as those of you in the military would have, I'm certain. Was not ACC. Yeah, if you're deployed, my younger brother was just sure he was going to go in the Navy. He's like 10 years younger than me, and that's wonderful. I mean, that's an amazing, noble profession. So he was talking to me about it, and I go, well, Josh, why do you want to go in the Navy? He goes, well, free college. Now, I said, that's true, free college. I said, but sometimes you also get a free trip overseas, and it's not always to a place where people like you, and occasionally they shoot at you. And for whatever reason, I think just because he was 17, he hadn't really thought of it that way, which I thought was interesting. But I know, if you're a military recruiter, you're probably not emphasizing that part. However, I know you're not denying that part either. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I got recruited for the military. I told them, you're not making the world safe for democracy if I'm in it. So we're all better off. Yeah. The fun part about it, that would be the college part, I assume you're saying, not the getting shot at part, unless you're unusual. I'm not saying you're unusual. Goodness. No, I believe we're all unusual. I had uncles, I'm old, we've talked about this, and my uncles all fought in Vietnam. The ones who didn't go to college to get an exemption. And they thought it was the greatest thing, the way that, when they talked about it, it's like, we were patriotic, we did our thing for our country, I wouldn't change a thing. But then when the 3 of them got together to talk about their experiences, none of us stayed in the room with them for more than about 2 or 3 minutes, because, yeah, okay. All right, but we'll talk about that later. You will get to hear some stories about Vietnam, but not too many, not gruesome ones. You could read about those, though. There's all sorts of books. All right, so GI Bill, which does get enacted, and yeah, okay. And then there's racial issues. I know you're probably surprised by this. You're thinking, no, we've solved all of our racial issues by this time period. Okay, maybe not. So there's lots of books written about this thing called the Zoot Suit Riots. And this happens 1943. Bunch of soldiers, folks in the Navy primarily, on shore leave. And they see a whole bunch of guys, primarily Mexican-American guys, wearing zoot suits. And this angers them, so they attack them. And some of you go like, why did the Navy guys care that people were wearing zoot suits? Well, they cared because, oops, let me try again here. They cared because there were rations on the amount of fabric that you could use. And a zoot suit was a really big suit, took up a lot of fabric. And it violated ration codes. So I was going to show you, I think I had pulled up a zoot suit photo. Crud, where'd it go? I know you guys don't know, by the way. I know you don't know. Let me try again. I was just sure I had it up. Let me click on it. Okay. Someday I will get better. Okay, so here's all the little zoot suit photos. And what you see, there's a guy kind of looking at the dude in a zoot suit, and he's kind of distressed because it's too much fabric. So you've got the really long coat. It goes to just above your knees. It's baggy, baggy pants. If we can find the right version of one, teen and snazzy zoot suit. You almost always have the long chain, which is attached to your belt and your wallet. There's usually a hat, although that's a costume. So, and I think that's fairly typical. And you normally saw this with young men of color Mexican American, African American men going to dance clubs. So, and let me stop sharing and go back to the notes. In Los Angeles, they probably just went over the border to Mexico and bought these suits because it wasn't illegal in Mexico. There were no ration codes there. So when the soldiers saw the young men in zoot suits, they got angry and they attacked them, and that's why they called it the Zoot Suit Riots. And then when the police were called, they arrested the Mexican American young men rather than the military guys who attacked them. So there's lots written about this, how this was probably racially motivated, mostly because it seemed racially motivated. So there you go. And I remember, I know I told the last class this, one year for Christmas, my sister-in-law bought me some dancing cat statue that had a zoot suit on. And if you pressed a button, the song Zoot Suit Riots came out of it. And I thought, that is one of the most strangely inappropriate things I've ever seen. It's really, I know. Anyway, all right. I always think of that when we talk about the Zoot Suit Riots, which is not really what I should think of, but I do. There's tons of stuff written about that. Probably find a book if you want.
Serna,
Yes.
can you look at the chat?
I'm looking at the chat. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
All right. I'm trying to look at the chat. Where'd the chat go? Is somebody leaving? Is something wrong?
Yeah, I just have a doctor's appointment at 1.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good luck at that. And yeah, go. Okay.
Cool, yeah, I'll just let you know. Alrighty, thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
No problem.
All right. I skipped the chat. Internment camps, and we'll tell Mitchell about this later, but I'm probably going to give you a link to this video because I tried to show it in the last class and wasn't terribly successful. So the video lasts about 9 minutes, and I'll send the link to you, and if there's an assignment you could do related to it that could potentially give you a few extra points, so that might be why you want to do it. But this video talks about how the US government decided that people of Japanese descent would be more likely to favor Japan if Japan invaded the West Coast. So it was really important to get these Japanese Americans away from the West Coast. So at first they moved them away from the coast, and then they decided it would just be better to move them to the middle of or closer to the middle of the country. So they forced them to sell their property, their businesses, all that sort of thing, and put them in camps, which were prison camps essentially. And so they took away all of their property, they suspended their constitutional rights, and put them in camps. So this is going to be one of the most amazing modern versions of civil rights violations that you probably will read about that you were less aware of. I know that you were clearly aware of lots of other things. I know when I was a kid, no one ever talked about these, and they were hard. It was hard to find information about it. And then later on, when I was a kid, little kid, like Happy Days, I don't know if you've ever seen that TV show. It was kind of a big TV show, and there was a guy on there whose name was, maybe it was Arthur, I think it was Arthur, and he was, later on he'll be Mr. Miyagi in the Karate Kid movies. And then there'll be a Star Trek TV show, and there'll be Mr. Sulu in there. Both Mr. Miyagi or Arthur and Sulu had been interned as children, so they were in these camps. So there's lots more written about this in the modern era, and there's also access to that video that I have the link for, which is the US government explanation of why it was important to go ahead and put these folks into camps, and makes it seem like they were happy to be there and didn't object. Now, there certainly weren't riots. There was no violent pushback about going to the camps. There were court cases. And later on, the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States, that Supreme Court case does say that what we did was constitutional. But a year later, the Supreme Court and the Civil Rights Commission will determine that what we did was not constitutional and was the result of war hysteria and racial prejudice. So, but in the video, it seems completely fine. So kind of interesting. Also, there'll be a group, and you could read a book about these guys too, called the Nisei Soldiers, which is like first generation born in the United States immigrant dudes. I suppose that's second generation, isn't it? 442nd Regiment, who volunteered out of these relocation camps or internment camps. Sometimes they are called concentration camps. I just don't want you to think that we killed people there. We mostly just took away their property and their civil rights, which is, it's pretty bad, isn't it? But these guys decided to volunteer to serve in the military for a country that had just stripped them of their property and their rights, which I think is amazingly, weirdly patriotic, because I know it wouldn't ever be my first thought if the government came and took my house away and put me in prison. I wouldn't go like, hey, why don't you let me, I definitely would not fight for the country, because as we've already said, that would not help the country, but let me go teach for free at the, the prison school or something. I don't know that that would be my first reaction. I'm pretty sure it would not. And the Fred Korematsu will, as a very old man, in 1992 get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So, and the U.S. government will issue an apology and a check, which the U.S. government rarely does. I don't know if we've seen very many apologies. I can't think of very many times that you've seen checks. Probably none, unless the government gets sued and loses, which does happen from time to time in the 1970s and 80s, but it'll be a while. We'll talk about it later when it happens. Also, the government is going to talk about how we are trying to end discrimination in countries like Japan and primarily Germany, of course. And then people of color who are in the military go like, hey, maybe we could do this at home as well. So they call that the double V campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory in the United States over racism. And then you'll start to see this push for Pan-Africanism, where people who are of African descent from countries that are not African countries start to push for equality within their home countries, and then for more rights and to end colonialism in Africa. So there you go. All right, I'm trying to think what else I wanted to talk to you about before we go. Civil Rights, Fair Employment Practices Commission. That's what's created after A. Philip Randolph leads the protests and then threatens the the strike, and in plants that produce artillery, armaments, that sort of thing, because African Americans are being paid, defense industry contractors, because African Americans are paid at a lower wage. And certainly the men in the military are of color are discriminated against. They serve in segregated units, still live in segregated barracks. And the exception to that happens if they serve in Western Europe for a period of time. They don't have barracks there. They don't have bases there yet. So they are housed in civilian housing, or, maybe there's French military units, something like that, but they're not segregated because they don't segregate in England and France. I know some of you think, well, that's because they're more wholesome and pure. Could be, or it could also be because those were in that era really, really white places. So there weren't a lot of people of as many ethnic backgrounds yet. And what you'll notice is as immigrants come into those countries, they're going to do similar things to the United States. And I'm really not trying to suggest, I would never, ever try to justify anything that the United States does that is racist or is wrong, that sort of thing. I do want to point out that for whatever reason, I'm going to go with human nature, but that's because I'm a little cynical, that this is what people in power do, is that they discriminate against people who are not in power. And that's, sort of the job of the rest of us to kind of keep them in line when we can. That's what I think. But I don't know. Sometimes we benefit from stuff, so we don't want to change it. But I don't know. Some of you are like, not me. And I go, sorry, I know. Kind of, sort of, no. All right, let me stop sharing the screen. All right, so I know we still have a little bit of time, and I'll check the roll again here in a second, but so the weekly question is to discuss the idea of World War II being the good war. And so I think you can find lots of stuff to talk about that clearly makes it the good war, who we're fighting against, who it is we want to defeat. You've got Nazis, you've got concentration camps, all that stuff's heinous. Japan is not exactly nice. You can look at stuff that Japan did to prisoners at Bataan, and you're not going to find much worse stuff ever done to somebody that was a prisoner of war. I mean, it's heinous stuff. So that part I think is pretty easy. You can also talk about changes that you see in the United States. More people at work. You've got the end of the Great Depression. You've got more opportunities for women, for all people of color. You've got this patriotism, which generally produces, positive effects and solidarity and unity in mostly positive ways. But then you've also got internment, you've got Zoot Suit riots, you've got segregation, you've got the need for a double V campaign where our government sees that it's important to end racism and bias against the Jews, way more than bias, I understand that, but the Holocaust, that sort of thing, but isn't as concerned about our own issues of race and ethnicity. And you see people in the United States pushing the United States to start making that more of a concern, which you can also see as good as well. And then, of course, you could talk about nuclear weapons or atomic weapons and whether those are good or bad. I do realize that those are, the side effects of those things the effects of those things are clearly bad. The use of those was sort of expected during that time period, but the end result of the development of that program, you may find to be negative. You may also go like, but there's energy uses and stuff like that. There's lots of ways to talk about all that stuff. But if you talk about the after effects in Japan of the use of nuclear weapons and recognize, of course, the United States is the only country to ever use those in war, that's difficult as well, and certainly not positive. So, there are going to be things that you'll easily be able to talk about that will show World War II as the good war. There's certainly amazing side effects, and also the purpose of it is good. But there are also some negative things that happen as a result. And of course, just that general destruction that any war causes, people are going to die and stuff gets destroyed and people are going to die. So that is hard. All right. So before we go, let me double check the roll. I don't think I saw Victoria Alvarez. And if you're here, you can type it in the chat or shout it out. Isaiah Castilla, Joshua Contreras, Christian Limon, Eric Constantino, and then somebody slipped in at the very end. I think it was Kennedy. All right, it's Kennedy, you better be paying attention there. I'm not threatening you. All right, it sounded like it though, didn't it? All right, so I think I am mostly done, but if you have questions that you want to ask, please stay behind and ask them. I'm going to go ahead and pause or stop the